Imagine waking up one morning and realizing your money buys less than it did yesterday. The same salary arrives, the same effort is spent, yet your daily expenses feel heavier. Nothing dramatic happened overnight, but something clearly shifted. Now imagine this change did not begin recently. Imagine it started decades ago because of a decision few people understood at the time, a decision that quietly reshaped the global economy. In 1971, the world changed how money works forever. There were no riots in the streets and no sudden economic collapse. Most people continued their lives without noticing anything unusual. But from that moment onward, prices began a slow and persistent climb. Year after year, purchasing power declined almost invisibly. And over decades, that invisible change transformed everyday life. Today, groceries feel expensive, housing feels unreachable, and savings feel weaker. Across countries and cultures, people share the same financial frustration. And the same question keeps appearing everywhere. Why does everything feel expensive now? Is inflation simply bad policy or temporary economic instability? Or is there a deeper system quietly shaping the value of money itself? To understand the present, we must first understand how money used to work. Because modern inflation did not suddenly appear. It evolved from structural changes made generations ago. After World War II, the global economy needed stability. The world had experienced depression, war, and financial chaos. Leaders wanted a system that prevented future instability. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries met in Bretton, New Hampshire. Their goal was simple but ambitious: create a financial system stable enough to rebuild the world economy. The result became known as the Bretton Woods system. Under this agreement, global currencies were linked to the US dollar, and the US dollar itself was tied directly to gold. Every dollar represented a fixed amount of gold held in reserves. This meant that governments could not freely create unlimited money. Gold imposed discipline on economic policy. If too much money entered circulation, gold reserves would decline, and declining reserves would signal economic imbalance. The system created natural limits on expansion. For decades, this arrangement worked remarkably well. International trade expanded rapidly. Economic growth accelerated across Europe, America, and Japan. Currencies remained relatively stable compared to earlier historical periods. Businesses could plan long-term investments with confidence. Global financial cooperation strengthened, but stability came with hidden pressure. As economies grew, governments needed greater flexibility, and flexibility was difficult under gold constraints. By the 1960s, the United States faced rising financial obligations. War spending increased dramatically during the Vietnam conflict. Domestic social programs expanded simultaneously. Government expenditures rose faster than gold reserves. More dollars circulated globally than could be backed by physical gold. The imbalance slowly became visible to other nations. Foreign governments began exchanging dollars for gold reserves. American gold holdings declined steadily throughout the decade. Confidence in the system weakened quietly behind diplomatic negotiations. Economists warned that the system could not continue indefinitely. Either spending would need to decrease or monetary rules would change. Political reality made spending cuts unlikely. Then came August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon addressed the nation on television. His announcement would permanently alter global finance. The United States suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Foreign governments could no longer exchange dollars for physical reserves. The gold standard effectively ended overnight. This moment became known as the Nixon Shock. Although presented as temporary, the change never reversed. The global monetary system entered a new era. For the first time in modern history, money was no longer tied to a scarce physical resource. Currencies became fiat money backed by trust and government authority. Value depended on confidence rather than commodities. At first, daily life seemed unchanged. Shops remained open and salaries continued normally. Most citizens barely noticed the transformation. But economists later described this decision as one of the most important financial shifts ever made. Because removing gold constraints fundamentally changed monetary power. Governments and central banks gained unprecedented flexibility. Without gold limitations, money supply could expand more easily. Economic crises could be addressed through monetary intervention. Recessions could be softened through policy actions. This flexibility solved many short-term problems. But it also introduced long-term consequences few fully understood. Consequences that would unfold slowly over decades. To understand those consequences, we must examine how modern money is created. Because money today does not enter the economy the way most people imagine. It is not simply printed and distributed evenly. Modern money largely enters through lending. Commercial banks create new money when issuing loans. Central banks influence this process through interest rates and policy decisions. When interest rates fall, borrowing becomes cheaper. Businesses expand operations, and consumers increase spending. Economic activity accelerates. When rates rise, borrowing slows and spending decreases. Inflation pressures reduce over time. Central banks constantly adjust this balance. The system allows economies to respond quickly to shocks. Financial crises can be softened through liquidity injections. Markets can stabilize before collapsing entirely. But increasing money supply changes purchasing power gradually. More currency circulates relative to goods and services. Prices begin adjusting upward. This adjustment does not happen instantly. It spreads slowly through wages, assets, and consumer markets, which is why inflation often feels confusing. People notice rising prices long before understanding the cause. The connection between monetary policy and daily expenses feels distant, yet the relationship remains deeply connected. And this is where the modern inflation story truly begins. After 1971, money entered a completely new phase of history where currencies were no longer limited by gold reserves or physical scarcity, but instead depended on institutional trust and economic management. This shift placed enormous responsibility on central banks, transforming them from simple guardians of currency stability into active managers of economic balance. Central banks began controlling economies primarily through monetary policy, aiming to maintain steady growth while preventing financial instability, and their most powerful instrument became interest rates. When economic activity slows, central banks lower interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, encouraging businesses to invest and consumers to spend, which increases overall demand and stimulates recovery. When inflation rises too quickly, interest rates are increased to make loans more expensive, slowing spending and reducing pressure on prices. This constant adjustment functions like an economic thermostat, where policymakers attempt to balance growth and stability by either stimulating or cooling economic activity. However, interest rates alone are not sufficient in modern economies, and central banks developed additional tools, the most influential being quantitative easing. Quantitative easing involves central banks purchasing government bonds and financial assets from markets, injecting newly created money into the banking system, which increases liquidity and encourages lending and investment. After the global financial crisis of 2008, this policy became widely used across major economies, with the Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, and Bank of Japan significantly expanding their balance sheets to stabilize financial markets. According to Federal Reserve economic data, money supply increased rapidly during this period, helping prevent deeper economic collapse while restoring confidence among investors and institutions. Stock markets recovered, unemployment gradually declined, and credit markets stabilized, but long-term effects began developing beneath the surface. Newly created liquidity did not immediately raise consumer prices because much of the money first entered financial markets, driving up asset prices such as stocks, bonds, and real estate. Economists refer to this phenomenon as asset inflation, where investment assets rise faster than wages or everyday goods, contributing to widening wealth gaps. Housing markets, in particular, experienced strong price growth as low interest rates increased demand for property while supply remained limited, making homeownership increasingly difficult for younger generations. Over time, liquidity spread beyond financial markets into the broader economy as businesses adjusted prices in response to rising costs and stronger demand, eventually leading to visible consumer inflation. This gradual transmission explains why inflation often feels sudden to the public, even though its causes develop slowly over many years. Another important component of the modern system involves government debt, as nations borrow heavily to finance infrastructure, social programs, and crisis responses. In fiat currency systems, governments repay debt using future currency rather than fixed commodities, meaning inflation can gradually reduce the real burden of debt over time, a process economists sometimes describe as debt erosion. Moderate inflation allows governments to manage large debt levels more easily because economic growth and tax revenues increase alongside rising prices. While policymakers often view this flexibility as necessary for stability, it introduces long-term consequences for households, particularly savers whose cash holdings lose purchasing power gradually unless invested. This shift encourages societies to move toward investment-based financial behavior, where individuals increasingly rely on stocks, real estate, and financial markets simply to preserve value rather than generate wealth. Over decades, this transformation changes cultural attitudes toward money, making investment participation almost essential for financial security. Global trade further amplifies inflation dynamics because modern economies are deeply interconnected through international supply chains, meaning disruptions in one region quickly influence prices worldwide. Energy costs provide a clear example, as rising oil prices increase transportation and production expenses across industries, eventually raising consumer prices even in countries without domestic shortages. This phenomenon, often called imported inflation, demonstrates how globalization spreads economic pressures across borders. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrated this interconnectedness when supply chains slowed while consumer demand recovered rapidly due to government stimulus programs and monetary expansion, creating shortages that pushed prices higher globally. Central banks responded by increasing liquidity to prevent recession, But strong demand combined with limited supply intensified inflation pressures across developed and developing economies simultaneously. Inflation is also shaped by expectations, a psychological component emphasized heavily in modern economic theory. When businesses expect higher future costs, they increase prices earlier to protect margins. And when workers expect inflation, they demand higher wages, reinforcing price increases in a feedback loop known as the inflation expectation cycle. Research from the Federal Reserve indicates that expectations themselves can influence real economic outcomes, meaning inflation is partly driven by collective belief about future economic conditions. This psychological dimension explains why inflation feels deeply personal and emotional despite being a macroeconomic process. Because inflation directly affects essentials such as housing, food, and transportation, individuals experience it not as an abstract statistic, but as a daily reality. By the early 21st century, fiat monetary systems had become the global standard, allowing governments and central banks to respond rapidly to crises while maintaining economic continuity. The system provided resilience during financial shocks, but also ensured persistent long-term inflation, as prices rarely declined permanently in flexible monetary systems. This leads to an important realization. Inflation is not merely an accidental outcome or policy failure, but a structural feature of modern economic design created to balance growth, stability, and crisis management, while gradually reshaping the value of money over time. Understanding this mechanism reveals that rising prices are not isolated events, but predictable outcomes of a system designed to prioritize adaptability over fixed monetary limits. And recognizing this connection changes how we interpret the economic pressures experienced today. As the modern monetary system continued evolving, its long-term effects gradually became visible in everyday life, especially during periods of economic stress when underlying structural forces surfaced all at once. For decades, inflation moved slowly enough that most people barely noticed its impact, but the early 21st century introduced conditions that accelerated existing trends rather than creating entirely new ones. Globalization connected economies more tightly than ever before, meaning production depended on complex international supply chains stretching across continents, and when disruptions occurred, their effects multiplied rapidly. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed this fragility when factories closed, shipping slowed, and labor shortages emerged simultaneously, reducing supply while governments attempted to protect citizens through stimulus spending and monetary expansion. Demand recovered faster than production capacity, creating a mismatch that pushed prices upward across nearly every sector of the global economy. Energy markets amplified this effect because oil and gas prices influenced transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and electricity simultaneously, meaning rising energy costs spread inflation through nearly all goods and services. Housing markets also played a central role as years of low interest rates encouraged borrowing and property investment, increasing demand faster than housing supply could grow, which drove prices higher and made home ownership increasingly difficult for younger generations entering the workforce. Wage growth, however, did not always keep pace with rising asset prices, creating the widespread perception that living standards were declining even when economies technically expanded. Economists often describe this as a divergence between nominal growth and real purchasing power, where incomes increase in numerical terms but fail to match the rising cost of living. This divergence contributes to the emotional experience of inflation, because people compare current expenses not only to income, but also to expectations formed by previous generations. Social media and global communication further intensify this perception by exposing individuals to lifestyles and economic realities across different regions, reinforcing awareness of financial pressure. Meanwhile, companies adjust pricing strategies based on anticipated costs, supply risks, and competitive behavior, meaning inflation becomes partially self-reinforcing once expectations shift. Central banks attempt to control these cycles by raising interest rates when inflation accelerates, reducing borrowing and slowing economic activity. But such actions often create short-term pain through slower growth, reduced investment, and higher unemployment risks. Policymakers therefore face a constant balancing act between controlling inflation and avoiding recession, illustrating the complexity of managing modern economies without fixed monetary anchors like gold. Another important factor shaping modern expenses is asset concentration, where rising financial markets disproportionately benefit those who already own investments, widening wealth gaps and increasing reliance on credit among households attempting to maintain living standards. Credit itself becomes both a solution and a vulnerability, enabling consumption while increasing long-term financial obligations tied to interest rates. As borrowing expands, economies become more sensitive to monetary policy changes, meaning rate increases designed to reduce inflation can simultaneously increase debt burdens for households and businesses. This interconnected system explains why economic adjustments often feel unpredictable to the public, even though they follow structural logic understood by policymakers and economists. Over time, inflation reshapes behavior by encouraging spending over saving, investment over cash holding, and long-term risk acceptance over financial stability, subtly transforming cultural attitudes toward money across generations. Younger populations increasingly view financial markets not as optional opportunities, but as necessary participation for preserving purchasing power, while older savings models become less effective in fiat currency environments. Technological change also interacts with inflation through productivity improvements and automation, sometimes reducing costs in specific industries, while overall price levels would continue rising due to monetary expansion and demand dynamics. Digital economies, subscription models, and platform services alter how consumption occurs, often making price increases less visible through recurring payments rather than one-time purchases, which further contributes to the perception that expenses continuously grow without a clear cause. Governments continue relying on fiscal spending to stabilize economies during crises, reinforcing the role of monetary flexibility introduced after 1971, while central banks coordinate globally to maintain financial stability through shared policy frameworks and communication strategies. Yet despite sophisticated economic management, the fundamental trade-off remains unchanged. Systems designed to prevent collapse inevitably allow gradual currency depreciation over long periods. This realization leads to an important perspective shift because inflation is not solely a problem to be eliminated, but a mechanism embedded within modern economic design, balancing growth, employment, debt sustainability, and financial stability. Understanding this does not remove financial pressure, but it explains why rising prices appear persistent across decades, regardless of political leadership or national boundaries. The feeling that life is becoming more expensive is therefore not merely psychological or temporary, but connected to structural forces shaping global finance since the end of the gold standard era. Every grocery bill, rent payment, and wage negotiation reflects interactions between monetary policy, global trade, expectations, and technological change, operating simultaneously beneath the surface of daily life. The modern economy functions less like a fixed system and more like a constantly adjusting network attempting to maintain equilibrium while absorbing shocks. And within that network, money itself evolves continuously, changing values slowly enough to sustain confidence, yet steadily enough to influence behavior. This leads to a final question that extends beyond economics alone. If inflation is a built-in feature of modern money, how should individuals and societies adapt to a world where purchasing power is never truly constant? Some economists argue that innovation and productivity growth will offset inflationary pressures over time, while others believe financial systems will continue evolving toward new monetary frameworks shaped by digital currencies and technological integration. Regardless of future outcomes, one reality remains clear. The rising cost of living experienced today is part of a longer historical transformation rather than an isolated moment. The decision made decades ago reshaped money into a flexible tool capable of stabilizing crises, but also capable of gradually redefining value itself. And once this connection becomes visible, everyday prices begin to tell a larger story, not just about markets or governments, but about how humanity chose to organize trust, value, and economic cooperation in the modern world. Understanding that story does not stop inflation, but it changes how we interpret the economic landscape around us, turning confusion into awareness and uncertainty into perspective. Because the hidden system behind rising prices is not simply about money becoming weaker, but about the world continuously adapting to a financial structure designed to evolve rather than remain fixed.